name's Clive Mendus, and I'm here today to talk to you about Geoffrey Chaucer and about the language he used, which is Middle English, and how to speak Middle English. Now, I'm an actor, and I also teach and direct, and in the mid-80s, I worked for a theatre company called the Medieval Players. The Medieval Players have their roots in Cambridge University, which is where they first produced medieval plays like this before they set up the company. And of course, being Cambridge University, they had lots of experts who were on hand who taught us how to speak Chaucerian English. So as a company, we did plays that predated Shakespeare, essentially. So we did one called Mankind, which was from 1490, and contains the first audience participation song, the first pantomime song, if you like. And then we also went on and produced plays based on the writings of Rabelais, and we did some of the York Mystery Cycle plays, and of course we did adaptations of Chaucer. The idea behind the kind of actors that we were going to be was that we would be jongleurs, what were known as jongleurs, or even troubadours. So that meant that we juggled firebrands, we danced on stilts, we played music on viols and hurdy-gurdies and rebecks and kettle drums, and we'd sing plain song unaccompanied. We did a bit of clowning, and last of all, we did a bit of acting as well, and often dressed like this. So Middle English is what was spoken in the Middle Ages, and that followed on from what had been spoken before, which is called Old English, which was largely Saxon, and the most famous literary work from that period was Beowulf, which is translated into modern English by Seamus Heaney particularly, but many others. And then, of course, Middle English came before modern English, which is what we speak now. So it's important to know there's no one version of Middle English that exists, just as there's no one version of modern English. The difference between the way somebody from Dundee or from Newcastle or from Cornwall speaks is really quite marked. And there's differences both in accent and dialect. For example, if let's take a term of endearment, for example. So in Newcastle you say, "Arit hinny," and in Cumbria you go, "All right, Mara." Derby you go, "All right, me duck." Scotland, "All right, pal." London, "All right, mate, you all right, yeah?" So all these differences of words and of accent. And the same was true in the medieval times, in the Middle Ages. So Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales in about 1387. And in about 1390, another great work of literary genius was written by a person known as the Pearl Poet, also known as Anonymous, who wrote Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. They're quite different in tone, these two writers. For one thing, the Gawain poet uses a letter that we don't have anymore. It's called Thorn, and it stands for TH, but it's one symbol instead of the two letters. So it looks immediately different on the page. You go, how on earth am I going to say that? Whereas you look at Chaucer, you go, well, it's a bit strange, but I think I can work out some of it anyway. So Chaucer is southern, courtly, and very French, and set in springtime. The Canterbury Tales are set in springtime. Whereas the Gawain poet, although he observes French custom in some of the behaviours in the story, of the courtly behaviour, it's much more Germanic and set in winter. So there's quite a different feel to it. Language changes with time. When we were all at school trying to learn another language, which we struggle with, particularly in this country, always struggle with, declining verbs, making things conjugate in terms of singular, plural, masculine, feminine, genitive, dative, all these things which to us are a bit difficult. They were gradually got rid of by the English. They basically started to get rid of these complexities of language, speaking and writing, and to simplify the use and style of language. And this had already started in the time of Chaucer. So what I'm going to do in a minute is I'm going to recite some of the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, which is basically the Canterbury Tales was 29 and 30 people went on pilgrimage to Canterbury Cathedral to worship at the shrine of Thomas à Becket, who was murdered and martyred about 100 years earlier. So they all meet in a pub called the Tabard Inn, and off they set, and there's a prize for the best story, but actually we never get to the prize giving. We don't know who tells the best story. That's up to us to decide. So this is the opening to the prologue of the Canterbury Tales. One that April with his shore sota, the drocht of March hath passed to the rota, and bathed every vine in switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the floor. One Zephyrus eke with his sweater breath, in spirit hath in every holt and heath the tenderer croppes, and the younger son hath in the ram his halve corpse ironne, and smaller fowlers maken melody, that slippen all the night with open ee, so pricketh them nature in here courages. Then longen folk to go on pilgrimages, and palmares for to second stranger stronders, to ferne halwes, couth in sundry londes, and specially from every shearer's end of England to Canterbury they wend, the holy blissful martyr for to sake, that hem have hope when that they were sick. Let's look a little bit now at how you speak Chaucer. Just listening to Chaucer can be misleading. I say this out of my own personal experience. Many years ago, before I joined the Medieval Players, I went to see them, and they were doing a version of The Pardoner's Tale, one of Chaucer's tales. And I'm sitting in the audience going, oh, I understand this. They keep talking about the doctor. So this is the doctor, and there's the doctor, and here's the doctor again. And then gradually I went, I'm quite sure if this is right. And I spoke to them afterwards, said, so doctor? They said, no, that's daughter. Because GH in daughter is pronounced like CH in loch, or double L in Welsh in Llanelli or Llewellyn. So it's doctor that I was hearing. Of course, nowadays we still spell daughter with GH, but the GH is silent, as in shush. The next question is how to pronounce a double vowel. So in our prologue piece there that I read just before, we had the modern English word root, so that's R-O-O-T. But in Middle English, it's spelled R-O-O-T-E. In Middle English, double vowels like double E or double O are pronounced with a long sound. So double O is more like or, double E is like air. Now, what we see now when we see it written on the page as eek, a mouse, is in Middle English means also and is pronounced ache, as in toothache, ache. However, there is also, with Middle English, you get an E often added on the end of the word. So root in Chaucer is written R-O-O-T-E, and the E has to be pronounced as well. So it needs to be wrote and this is true of a whole host of words in Chaucer with an E on. You've got to pronounce it, and it sounds very odd to our ear, because you look at the words and you go, it should stop. But it doesn't, it has the E and you have to say it. So something like, for example, I've got some examples here, tender, which is tendre, or young is younger, or end is ender, and so on. And there are scores of examples. Lastly, there is also another aspect of Middle English, which is the French sound, the influence of French. So a word like pilgrimages, which is the modern English word, pilgrimages, but in Middle English, the G is soft, so it's more pilgrimage, which is much more like you would say it in France. For example, also the word vertu is in this, in the prologue, which again is much more French sounding. And in fact, when you speak the Chaucerian English, having a little bit of a sense of a French accent will also help, along with doing your double vowels, pronouncing your extra E. A last word on pronunciation. Chaucer wrote before what linguists call the great vowel shift. Not perhaps as exciting as it sounds. But over a period of, I'm not sure, about 100 years, there was a change in the way vowels were pronounced. So nowadays, in modern English, anywhere south of Birmingham is likely to say grass, castle. Anywhere north is more likely to say grass, castle. This way of speaking, as they still do in the north, was much more the way they would pronounce vowel sounds in the days of Chaucer. So that in the opening prologue there, when he talks about the month, April, as we would say nowadays, you have to speak it like April. There's a word he used to make. We would say maken, if we were to read it with a sort of southern English accent, maken, but in his Chaucer's time it would have been maken. Yeah? So short A. Similarly, the letter Y is more like an I, so you see the word written W-Y-F, like wife, but it has to be pronounced with. The word L-Y-K, like, has to be pronounced lick. So it can be very confusing. What you hear isn't necessarily what it means, as we've already said. Not all Chaucer can be understood by hearing it or reading it. There are many words that have fallen out of use, and so quite often you find you need a glossary that can explain some of these words for you. So in our last extract today, I'm just going to read you the story of what I'm going to say, because it's less well known perhaps. An old woman, bent with age, lives with her daughters, in a small cottage near a wood with a yard, surrounded by a fence, in which there is a cockerel called Chanticleer. Perhaps some of you have heard of Chanticleer. In the first line, you will hear pauvre, which means poor, or widwe, which means widow, or sondale, which means somewhat, and willom in the second line, which means once upon a time. So this last extract is the narrator from the Nuns' Priest's Tale. A pauvre widow, sondale stap in age, was whilom dwelling in a narrow cottage, beside a grove, standing in a down. This widow, of which tell jou mitan, sin vilke die that she was last a with, in patience lad a full, simple life. A yen she had, encloset alabout with stickies, and a drear ditch without, in which she had a cock, hicht Chanticleer. In all the land of crowing nas his pay. His voice was murrier than the murray or goal on Messadies that in the church go. Well sickerer was his crowing in his loge than is a clock or an abbey or loge. His comb was redder than the feen corral, and batiled as it were a castle wall. His bill was black, and as the jet it shone. Like azure were his leggies and his torn, his nailies whiter than the lily floor, and like the buried gold was his cologne.